Good morning, ladies and gentlemen from Madagascar, from the Fritz studios here at the FES in Antananarivo. We are continuing our series on the climate crisis in Africa and the preparations for COP27. I'm very happy to talk today to the person we have to talk to if we want to get the broader picture when it comes to the COP conferences. It's my dear colleague, Richard Worthington from the FES office in Johannesburg. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Konstantin. Good to be with you.
If I'm not mistaken, you had been participating in 10 COP conferences already. Is that correct?
That is correct, but not for a while. My first COP was the extension of the 6th COP in 2000, and I was participating through the Climate Action Network mostly, and an NGO here in South Africa, Earthlife Africa, and was following that even when I changed to WWF through to the COP in Durban, COP 17 in 2011. And that's been my last COP, although I have been keeping an interest in the negotiations, but not trying to engage in person since that particular COP.
Are you in a position to say what actually changed between the time when you were closely following the COP negotiations and nowadays?
Many things. You know, one of the big push that I was involved in was leading up to the Copenhagen COP in 2009. So there was a valiant effort by many in civil society and some delegations from countries to reach a legally binding treaty in Copenhagen. That had been the intent, and there were straw dog treaties developed with expertise from around the world. But I think most people will have heard that Copenhagen became Nopenhagen, and it was rescued from total defeat in the eyes of many by world leaders having a powwow where Obama came in as the president of the United States and cobbled together a declaration that included some ballpark commitments, but on a kind of promise basis. And thus it was considered that the process wasn't dead, but it had taken a serious knock. Basically, from there till Paris in 2015, we lost the prospects of a legally binding treaty. And so codified in Paris was the pledge and review approach, which means that countries say they will do a whole bunch of things and that they will review their achievements, but there aren't actually consequences for failing to honor their pledges. What we did get in Paris were at least a stronger orientation to the science, in that the objective of below 2 degrees and trying our best for 1.5 stabilization were codified. But as I say, not in the legally binding agreement. So I would say that's the major change. Some of the other changes have been, of course, in terms of the context. Back in 2000, China was a relatively small emitter. China will overtake America, not just in terms of absolute emissions, which happened a couple of years ago, but also in terms of historic emissions. There was a very clear rationale for the distinction between what in the convention are called Annex I countries, the industrialized, developed, most responsible for the massive greenhouse gas emissions, and the developing or non-Annex I countries. But those balances, if you like, of responsibility and also capability, of course, with the development of a lot of countries, have changed very substantially in the last 20 years. And the prospect of future emissions is now very clearly there, that the trend is for the large developing nations to keep increasing their emissions for some years yet. So whereas we were hoping that global emissions might peak, I mean, we were talking at one stage about 2010 or 2015, we're now looking to 2025, which obviously leaves 1.5 in the dust, but hopefully we can still say below 2 degrees.
We are talking about the 27th conference coming up now. Why is it there is so little progress?
One of the things that the climate negotiations have not got traction on is the broadening of capitalism and the entrenchment, in particular, of neoliberal capitalism. So, one of the things that some people say about the climate negotiations is that they're economic negotiations by proxy. And so a lot of the things that inhibit progress on climate are really about individual nations pursuing their national interests on an economic basis. And we could have been fashioning other kinds of international agreements to address those issues. The World Trade Organization has not had great success in improving the fairness of trade. If there'd been more success on that front, it would have made the climate negotiations easier. So each time there's excuses that can be found for things that are happening on the global stage that are making it more challenging to come up with binding agreements on climate change response, adaptation, mitigation. And now, of course, we're also trying to get loss and damage in there as well. So some people might say, well, one of the reasons that we keep failing is that we are still wedded to economic growth as the engine of development. And we measure this in GDP, not in terms of the real value of all of human activity.
Is there any point in meeting at all again in Sharm El Sheikh next month?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that tends to happen with COPs is that in the lead up to the COP, people are pushing everything that they would like to see. So there's raising expectations because everyone wants to try and get what they want, at least on the table for discussion, and to push for the best possible outcome. Once the COP starts, the mode shifts to managing expectations because the expectations are always overloaded relative to what might be taken out of it. And by the time you're halfway into the COP, generally the other thing going on is the blame game. People start anticipating the disappointments and thinking about how they can blame other parties for not achieving what they have said they will try to achieve going into it. So, yeah, if we think that the only purpose of getting together at an annual basis at a conference of parties is the negotiated text outcome, then it would be easy to say, well, what's the point? But of course, a hell of a lot more goes on during a conference of the parties. There's the subsidiary bodies on science. So a lot of work happens that is below the level of the headline outcomes that get reported in media and that most people treat as the kind of benchmarks against which to judge success. There are things that progress out of the spotlight at these negotiations. So, and I do think that there is still validity. Of course, they do not have to be quite the big jamborees that often happen. And, the thing is that hosting a high-profile event like this brings out a whole lot of people within the national government that is hosting that don't give a damn about climate change. They just see it as an opportunity to promote the country, both reputationally and, for example, as a tourist destination. Where are the negotiations happening? At what is basically a resort town in Egypt, right? So, and the same thing happened in Cancun, a resort town in Mexico. I was flabbergasted when I was at the COP in Delhi at the opulence and they had elephants parading, bejeweled and all dressed up, and they had these grand parades. They had a soccer field covered with tables with whiskey flowing and imported wine. And I was looking at this going, how does this fit with negotiations that, amongst other things, need to address excessive consumption? And yet they put on a kind of feast of excessive consumption. So one of the things that does somewhat undermine the COPs, I think, is the way that they get taken up for reasons other than reaching agreement on climate. But there seems to be no talking countries out of taking that approach.
What are we talking about when it comes to the most likely or probable outcomes of COP27?
Well, I'm sorry to say that given our global context, I think the best that one's going to be able to get out of it is to talk about incremental progress. I don't think we're going to get a great breakthrough. Quite a lot of attention from developing countries is on a loss and damage mechanism. But from speaking to people who are very close to the negotiations, the sense is that it's going to take a couple of years to get to that. If we can get a formalization of the Santiago network, which is an initiative to work towards a loss and damage mechanism that is at the moment happening in parallel with the UNFCCC process with countries that have voluntarily joined the Santiago initiative. If we can get that formalized under the UNFCCC process so that everybody starts participating in it, that will be progress. But one of the challenges of negotiations under the convention is that they happen by consensus. So any party can block an agreement. And Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular have a long history in this regard. Given that everything has to be agreed by consensus, it is a lowest common denominator. The verdict on COP27 will look both at the formal process and at things happening in parallel.
What has to happen so that the COP27 presidency doesn't have to go before the press at the last day saying, we are sorry how this process unfolded?
Good question. Tough, though. I mean, I do think that moving the loss and damage discussions under the convention itself will be one of the key things that people look at. But given everything else that's going on in the world, that is still a big ask. I don't think any country as a host is going to admit defeat. I mean, the UK arguably were greenwashing the outcomes of COP26. By the time you're halfway into the COP, the blame game has already started. And one of the key players in the blame game is always going to be the host, looking to find other people to say, well, we did our very best as the hosts. And I can't envisage any particular outcome that would induce a host country to actually sincerely acknowledge defeat in terms of the objectives. And particularly given the authoritarian government that's involved as hosting this COP, it is not the way of authoritarian countries to acknowledge shortcomings.
Let's talk Africa for a second, Richard. The Egyptian presidency of COP27 was announcing that even though obviously Egypt is not an African country as such, like as we understand Sub-Saharan Africa, this should also be an African COP. Do you see the African interest recognized so far?
Rhetorically, yes. In terms of substance, no. I find it challenging when people talk about an African COP because we had a COP in Nairobi before, and yet people managed to forget about that. I heard people saying after COP26, when it was finalized that it would be in Egypt this year, it'll be our first African COP. And I'm like, well, that shows us how much of an African COP we had when it was in Nairobi, doesn't it? Because people don't even remember that there was an African COP. But this does come back to the question you asked about, is there any point in doing these things? And there is also value in having these annual stock takings, because part of what happens at a COP is to take stock. They prepare reports in advance to both in terms of pledges, but also progress in reducing emissions, and also in terms of adaptation and the means of implementation. So these stock-taking exercises are valuable in themselves, and they can also be useful for work at the domestic level.
Is it that the African countries sufficiently work together to make sure that their voices are heard? Yes,
that is a key component of it. And there's been some interesting dynamics this year where there was a gathering of ministers that came up with some idea about leveraging South Africa, Africa's. So the idea that came up from ministers who aren't that familiar with the climate negotiations, or indeed with science, apparently, was that Africa should try and leverage our potential use of fossil fuels in the future to gain concessions from the most responsible, historically, and the wealthiest parties. And the Africa group of negotiators pushed back very hard against that, saying that they didn't see that as in any way a conducive strategy. They thought that that would actually just give grounds for Africa to get shorter shrift at the international negotiations. So, that is encouraging in that 10, 15 years ago, the African group of negotiators struggled to get the attention of high-level politicians, and within the African Union, climate change was barely on the agenda, and certainly not coherently on the agenda, even in the lead up to Copenhagen. So I do think that the African Union has made significant progress in mainstreaming climate change within its own deliberations. And so that Africa group of negotiators have become somewhat more influential.
Are African countries focusing too much on money?
All I can say to that is it's a matter of opinion, because while it's not in the text, it's always an implication. Countries commit to things, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, there are financial implications. So I would not like to call Africa out for focusing a lot on money. I'm inclined to say, well, they're just being more explicit about it, whereas those from whom the money must flow are really keen to avoid talking about money. The parties to the convention and the Paris Agreement are nation states that are operating in a competitive global economy. So to pretend that money is not a big part of it it's in the interests of those who are the richest. I wouldn't want to say it's illegitimate for countries in Africa to put quite a bit of focus on that, because it's not like the others aren't thinking about it.
What has to happen to make sure that the issue of climate justice as political challenge of the 21st century could play a major role in the negotiations in Egypt?
The representatives of vested interests are very good at co-opting language that has been developed by those seeking justice and using it to further their own interests. This happens in South Africa quite strongly, but I think there's also a global dynamic around this, whereby just transition is translated into leave no one behind, is translated into protecting the jobs of those in the incumbent energy system. And the incumbent energy system is the fossil fuel system, which is the primary driver of climate change. The huge fossil fuel companies are now using just transition as a way to justify delaying the phase out of fossil fuels in the name of justice for their workers. And, these are the same companies that are refusing decent wage increases for their workers and all sorts of other things. So for climate justice to be advanced, what's going to happen under climate negotiations will be incremental. We hope it will impact on multilateral interactions that happen at other levels. I mean, ultimately, if we're looking for climate justice, we have to be confronting financialization and the power of the financial sector. And climate negotiations don't actually have traction on that. They can provide a moral foundation for other work. And this is where I'd mention something like the non-proliferation treaty suggestion for fossil fuels. This is saying, a consensus approach under climate negotiations, it's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses. In parallel, what we need is something which will be eventually legally binding on global use of fossil fuels, because otherwise there's always going to, you can get even the largest and most self-interested corporations to have a change of heart But then there's going to be others running around the side who are unscrupulous, who will still exploit those resources. So what you actually have to do is come up with an agreement on what you'll leave in the ground. As a foundation for that, you need a registry of all global fossil fuels, and that we don't have yet. And that alone makes it easier to get a grip on what we need to be doing to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, as in leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Until we have a global registry and we can see who's doing what and start shutting it down. And, that is where a lot of the justice will actually play out. Because is it just that the British should be doing more exploration in the North Sea and discouraging countries in Southern Africa from exploring their resources? No, it's not. How do we get a grip on that? Well, we don't want to turn off energy supplies to anybody overnight. That's not going to be good for anybody either. That's not going to serve justice. So we need a planned phase out. And we're not going to get a planned phase out by individual pledges from either countries or companies, unless we're looking at the big picture. So I do think that even at a COP, there will be efforts to promote these things that try to work in parallel. And if we make progress on those, that is part of what happens under the auspices of the COP.